from Michelin's introduction. Now we will have our next speaker, who is Preston, and he was an editor of the New Atlas in 2002, as well as earlier atlases of scarce plants and aquatic plants, and later the hybrid flora in 2015. Please welcome Preston.
Thank you. My presentation going to come up magically.
If you press next slide,
Right.
Thank you. Come up.
Yeah. Well, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here at this celebratory occasion. And as it happened, about the same time I was invited to speak, I was reading about the Oxford botanist Jacob Bovart the Elder, 17th century figure. And we're told that he had his beard tagged with silver on days of rejoicing. I was totally tempted for a day or two to wonder if I could manage this, but then I looked at a picture of Bovart and it's the most wonderful beard and large and rippling, and I realized I couldn't compete with that. So I'm afraid you have me here, but I'm silvered. And my brief is to give a talk on the prehistory of the current project, really. How did we get here? And in Cambridge, we like to look back to John Ray. And one of Ray's comments in the preface to his Cambridge catalogue in 1660, as in recent decades, come to seem rather prophetic. And I'm quoting it here in the translation of Philip Oswald, who's a much missed colleague. And Ray urged others, in emulation of us, to investigate the spontaneous plants, each of his own area, more diligently, so that in this way, the complete Phytologia Britannica might finally appear from all their contributions. Well, it must be admitted that Ray's encouragement had almost no effect on his contemporaries at all, and I suppose that's what happens to prophets. But it was only a century later that a county other than Cambridge was covered by a book-length flora, and that was Oxfordshire in 1794. And not until well into the 19th century that county floras began to be written with any frequency. And it was in the 19th century too that there was the first systematic attempt to bring together information on the geographical and altitudinal distribution of British flowering plants. And this was the life work of this rather stern figure we see here, Hewitt Cottrell Watson. Watson was rather an unlikely pioneer of collaborative recording, as he was notoriously quarrelsome and all too ready to attack his fellow botanists in print. But he did have many virtues, including persistence, and the publication of this book, Topographical Botany, in 1873, 1874, was the culmination of 4 decades of work. And in this, he detailed the distribution of British species in the 112 vice counties he devised for the purpose. Watson loved to tabulate or to list his data, and this is rather typical of the page that's in the 4th volume of his Cyberly Britannica. And this, I think, very much fits into an early and mid-Victorian trend for the accumulation of statistics in an extent to understand the world. And I think he's the most famous exponent of such methods was his contemporary Florence Nightingale, who was rather sort of romanticized in my youth as the lady with the lamp, but was quite a formidable statistician. And as this paper says, she accumulated a formidable array of statistical information. Her enjoyment was so immense that she found the sight of a long column of figures was perfectly reviving. And like so many Victorians during this time, Nightingale felt empowered by the pervasive passion for statistics. I think this is very much like Watson. It must be admitted that Watson lacked Nightingale's flair for the presentation of statistics, but he did flirt with maps and altitude diagrams in one of his early books, admittedly an abortive one. And in this work, published in 1843, he presented outline maps of the distribution on the left, and he filled in the numbers for the provinces. He hadn't got the fine-grained vice counties there in which the plant appeared, and the numbers on the right were filled in, and in the northwest, where the species doesn't appear, in say, the Hebrides, there isn't a number. And readers were invited to colour in the maps to show the distributions themselves. But helpfully, he coloured in, or Minion coloured in the first 5 to show you how it could be done. And so for species 2, you can see meadow roof, Thalictrum flavum, southeastern species, and a very much lowland species. Whereas in species 4, Thalictrum alpinum, the distribution has been coloured in using the detailed sites on the right. And you can see from the altitude that it's restricted to high altitude in the southern edge of its range in North Wales, northern England, but gets down to the coast in the far north of Scotland. But this publication was abandoned when he realised it would be just too time consuming and expensive to complete it. Other authors were more prepared to use vice county data to construct maps, and the example I've chosen is from this paper by E.J. Salisbury, which was very influential in its time, but I suspect now almost forgotten, on the East Anglian flora, in which he's used both simple vice county maps and ones shaded by frequency. And in case you think that these maps are something from the dim and distant past, I should point out that as a research student, I actually corresponded with Sir Edward Salisbury as he became. So we've gone from this sort of map to the very sophisticated maps we'll no doubt see later on today in just 2 botanical lifetimes. And the use of these vice county maps continued into the post-war years, illustrating, for example, the papers in the Biological Flora of the British Isles series in the Journal of Ecology, and in the more popular New Naturalist series in books such as Summerhayes' Wild Orchids of Britain. And in fact, it was the New Naturalist that developed the base map on which much of the vice county mapping was done. Now, it was in the post-war period that there was a great increased interest in plant distribution from academic botanists, and the interests of a range of botanists seems to have converged on distribution mapping, including botanists applying new taxonomic methods such as cytological studies and experimental hybridization, those seeking to understand the limits of the range of individual species, and perhaps particularly the pollen analysts, who are demonstrating at this time the changing distributions of species through time and trying to interpret the concentrations of rare species, such as those found in Upper Teesdale, in the light of these results. And there was even an interest in the spread of alien species. And I think at this time, things were much less compartmentalized than they would be today. And so a botanist like Max Walters, who was primarily a taxonomist, could write the paper I've shown here with Donald Piggott on discontinuous distributions, which became extremely influential amongst those studying the ecology and history of the British flora. And Piggott himself, who died only very recently, was at the start of his career an experimental taxonomist and an ecologist. And with his wife, Margaret, he wrote at least 1 paper using pollen analysis. We see him in the photo here, sampling of mallow. And there was not only an overlap between the interests of academic botanists and field botanists, but the academic botanists were usually or often field botanists in their own right. And yet, with all this interest in plant distribution, the only maps available to British botanists were those crude vice county maps I've already shown. Whereas in Scandinavia, as here in 2050, in Denmark, in Belgium, in Holland, botanists have been refining the techniques of mapping species in a variety of different ways. And this was the environment in which the first Atlas of the British Flora came to be planned and eventually published in 1962. And it was in the same year, 1950, that the BSBI held a conference in which several speakers highlighted the inadequacy of mapping on a vice county basis, such as here. Although in one paper, James Dandy fought valiantly in the last ditch to defend the vice county recording system and snagged continually at the grid-based systems. But despite Dandy's efforts, the conference agreed to discuss the possibility of preparing and producing a series of maps of the British flora. And as a result of these discussions, a grant of £10,000 was obtained from the Nuffield Foundation for a 5-year project, the BSBI map scheme, under Max Walters, who we've already seen, Cambridge as director, and with Franklin Perry as senior worker. The map scheme adopted the grid recording and the recording cards that had already been used in the Netherlands and indeed demonstrated at the 1950 conference, and it added, though, two crucial elements. The first was technological, the mechanical plotting of maps by putting records onto punch cards, using the punch cards to drive plotters such as this. And the second element was the aim to recruit as many recorders as possible to survey all the 10-kilometre squares in Britain and Ireland in just 5 years. It took a further 2 years to process the results, a period in which the Nature Conservancy stepped in to finance the project, and the atlas was published, as we've seen from Kevin's talk, in 1962. And in the successful conclusion of this project, Frank Perring became the head of the Nature Conservancy's newly created Biological Record Centre, and the first task was to, that's Frank somewhere in London, I suspect, I've never worked out where this photo was taken. The first task was to produce a critical supplement, engaging with taxonomic experts to map some of the critical species and hybrids that haven't been covered in the main book. The 1962 Atlas was one of the most influential natural history books ever published, I think, but its influence wasn't really that its sponsors had expected. Its approach for mapping was adopted for plant and animal groups at county, national and international scales, almost worldwide. And in Britain, it highlighted the rarity of some species and the extensive declines of others, which is a very timely contribution to the growing debate on nature conservation. And it's this that led directly to the British Red Data book by Franklin Perring and Lynn Farrell in 1977. Now, Lynn could only find one photograph of her in her Oxford years. On the right, blown up from a staff photo with Frank on the left. The Atlas also reinvigorated the production of county floras in the Ray tradition, though not like his, but the careful analytical and experimental research, which had been expected to follow as a direct result of the Atlas, never really materialized. And the academic use of the Atlas was rather limited and at best only indirect. It was in 1980 that I joined the Biological Record Centre to replace Frank Perring as his botanist. And it was becoming clear then that the 1962 maps were seriously outdated, partly because of the massive stimulus they'd given to recording at the county level, as we see here, and also the massive changes which had been inflicted on the British countryside by modern agriculture. There were discussions in the 80s about whether the project could be repeated, but opinions were divided. Some, and they included the irrepressibly optimistic Frank Perring, thought it could be, but a significant number of the senior BSBI members took the view that they'd managed it in their youth, but they were now far too busy to go through all that again. And there was a particular worry that they might be swamped by potential recorders with a great deal of enthusiasm but little expertise. And it was Frank Perring who therefore suggested a partial survey of 1 in 9 of the 10-kilometre squares, which would allow us to assess whether a further survey was feasible and also tell us whether there'd indeed been a substantial change in the flora as we suspected. And this was the birth of the BSBI monitoring scheme. Grant was obtained from the Nature Conservancy Council, and Tim Rich was employed to coordinate the project. There's Tim, hard at work. The monitoring scheme, under Tim's dynamic leadership, sometimes was more dynamic than it looked at, showed that it was indeed possible to rerun a national scheme. And many enthusiastic recorders came forward to support the world-weary veterans of the 1962 Atlas. It also showed that there had been substantial changes in the flora. But Tim encountered a major problem, which I don't think we'd anticipated at all when the project was set up. The problem of comparing the results obtained in 1962 with the resurvey of the same squares. And I think it was with Mark Hill's advice that he developed a method aimed at identifying statistically significant change in the different countries. Now, when the ornithologists completed their resurvey of breeding bird distributions in 1993, they didn't encounter any such problems of comparison, or so they said. But they were a feature of other groups, such as butterflies. And the statistical comparison of the results of repeated surveys became a substantial field of research into the 21st century, as we'll no doubt hear later on. Following the success of the monitoring scheme, the way was clear for a complete resurvey of the vascular plants in Britain and Ireland. There was a delay while we sought funding because the Nature Conservancy Council were initially unsympathetic as they saw the scheme as diverting attention from rare and threatened species. But DETR, who were the predecessors of the current DEFRA, stepped in to fund the scheme as they saw the relevance of the results to their wider environmental remit. National Parks and Wildlife Service were the sponsors in the Irish Republic. Once funding had been secured, Trevor Dines was employed to lead field recording and data collation, working with me from BRC and David Pearman, BSBI, ably assisted by Henry Arnold, Jane Croft and others. Field recording was completed in 1999 and the resulting new atlas published in 2002. This is our equivalent of today's watch then. Looking back on the new atlas, it seems to me to have been very transitional in its methods. In Britain, half the recorders sent their data in on paper MasterCards, which they entered their 10-kilometre square records manually. They were then input at BRC and the results printed off and returned in the post for checking. The other half submitted their data electronically, usually by disc committed to the post, but as they were often able to provide more records and more details, the number of records submitted electronically greatly outnumbered those derived from the MasterCards. The computerized records came in a wide range of forms, using programs such as AdditSite, Biobase, and Recorder. Some recorders use their own programs, which they'd written themselves. There was a recommended format for data transfer, which was often ignored. Fortunately, Trevor Dines had worked for, we appointed him, in developing one of the software packages, so he was able to undertake some of the time-consuming work needed to reformat the data, and Henry Arnold at BRC did the rest. And we sometimes thought that the only thing that those submitting electronic data had in common was their conviction that any errors in the data they sent could possibly be their fault and must have been caused when their data was processed after submission. It wasn't at all certain that the atlas would have an accompanying text. Both the 1962 atlas and the monitoring scheme had published maps without species text, but the Atlas of Bryophytes, published in 1991 to 94, had shown how such a text could complement the published maps, even for groups with large numbers of species. We had incorporated the editing of text into our costings for DEFRA, but at the last minute, this element of the funding had been withdrawn as DETR faced a sudden demand to spend money on research into cormorants, so we lost out the cormorant. We, however, decided to go ahead with the plans for the text anyway and somehow managed to squeeze it into the project. And David Pearman did a lot of work to research one of the novel elements, the first records in the wild, the first records in cultivation of alien species. And we're still working on that aspect of the project 20 years later. We did encounter one problem which Kevin alluded to his talk when trying to separate native and alien occurrences of species on draft distribution maps. And that was that there was a whole group of species, such as the poppies, which were treated as native, but didn't grow anywhere in sites where they could conceivably be native. And this led us to the concept of archaeophytes, which had been developed in Central and Northern Europe, which had somehow bypassed British botanists. My zoological counterpart at BRC, Mark Telfer, had been thinking for some years of a statistical method of comparing the results of repeat atlas surveys. And he developed his method by the basis for our treatment. And this gave us an index value for each species that measured the magnitude of its relative change in relation to other species. We didn't measure the statistical significance of the change, and that caused some raised eyebrows at the time. We could then use this index value in conjunction with traits databases that had been developed in the 1990s, often under the auspices of the countryside survey to allow a much more detailed analysis of change than had been possible when the monitoring scheme was completed just a decade earlier. So, for instance, we looked and had a similar pattern of the increase of neophytes, decline in archaeophytes in all the different regions. The coloured bars are different regions. And we showed, for instance, that species of low nutrient requirements had decreased in relation to species of high nutrient requirements. And unlike the first atlas, the results of the new atlas were used in quite a wide range of research studies because computer technology had by then caught up, and it allowed the analysis of such data sets in a way that had been impossible 40 years previously. And research methods were much more geared to these broad-scale analytical studies. And you might perhaps cynically think that academics were much more geared to wanting publications. Like the earlier atlas, we too had planned a critical supplement. We decided that the data we had on hybrids were both incomplete and in need of considerable critical scrutiny. So we decided to reserve them for later treatment. But fortunately, Clive Stace agreed to our suggestion to combine our maps with a detailed text, replacing an earlier work he'd written on hybrids, he'd edited on hybrids in 1975. And the supplement morphed into a book of its own right. Well, I think that takes us to the end of the prehistory. But before I finish, I think I must congratulate all those who brought the current amazing atlas to such a successful conclusion. I've always looked in awe at the work done by Vice County recorders who contributed so much to it, though I can't say I have any personal experience of the effort involved. But as you've heard, I do have what I think is now called lived experience in the role of an editor. And the work in the new atlas certainly pushed me closer to my limits than anything else I've ever done. I suspect the same is true of my fellow editors. So it's with particular feeling and warmth that I can congratulate the editors on their role, and in particular Pete Stroh, who's had the responsibility of tying the whole thing together.
Thank you, Chris. That was a fascinating account of the development of explorers and atlases. Next, we have none other than Pete Stroh. We're doing questions. Okay. Does anyone have a question they would like to ask Chris Preston?
Chris, this arises from the battle between vice counties and grid squares. Just looking at the continent, and particularly France, which I know better than most of the continent, there's been the same sort of battle between recording by commune, which is the equivalent of a civil parish in this country, and by grid squares. And there was a whole run of floras that went one way or the other. They seem now to have decided to do it both ways. Was there ever any thought of doing it at a more local scale, both ways, during this history?
No, I mean, Dandy would very much have favoured a vice county in the parish approach, and he took the view that nobody would ever relate to grid squares, that they were impersonal units. But no, it seems to be, and there were papers, weren't there, in Watsonia by John Doney, even into the 70s and 80s, trying to abolish vice counties and give everyone a 50 by 50 kilometre square to record. And it seems to be only recently that people have come round to thinking that the two could be combined. But I suppose the problem in Britain is we don't have the sort of intermediate units, do we? Whereas, I mean, the Scandinavians are very keen, the Swedish have their parishes, which I think are larger than ours, and they're very fundamental units, which are on all the herbarium specimens. It sounds rather like the communes, but we don't relate to our parishes anymore, I suspect.
Well, I suppose we are beginning to relate to them again now, because there are parish councils who take some interest in their environment. not always at a very important level, but
Right,
they
yes.
at least take the interest. And of course, the technology makes it a lot easier now.
Yes,
The GIS simply
Yes.
to produce those by turning the handle, really.
yeah, yeah. Right, yeah.
Any other questions?